Escape by Moonlight, Chapter 3, page 22, boys and girls. What happened? What happened? Grandma asked, staring at Dewey with eyes that were dazed and uncomprehending. So she was staring at Dewey. She didn't understand what was going on because she was asleep, right? She had been awakened abruptly. So when I think of abruptly, what was that? Unexpectedly, suddenly she was awakened from her sleep, and she could not understand why Dewey had thrust her aside and grabbed the gun. Why Dewey had pushed her with sudden force and grabbed the gun. Head up, please. Dewey's chest was heaving so rapidly he could not speak for a moment. Then he said, "It was an Indian." At the mention of the fearful word, she stepped back. She sat down hard in her rocking chair. "Indians?" she said starkly. The dog whined, and Dewey looked away from the horizon and at him for the first time. Then he stepped quickly from the cabin and picked him up. "Look at his leg, Grandma. He can't hardly walk on it." He set the dog in the cabin and closed the door. Although his hands were shaking, he held a splinter in the glowing ashes of the fireplace until it flamed and then lit the oil lamp with it. If you could just walk around and make sure people are following along. I'm recording right now, so I can't come around and... "Indians?" Grandma said again. The boy swallowed and wiped his nose on the sleeve of his shirt. "I got to fix Charlie's leg," he said, then added loudly, "Anyway, it was just one, Grandma." She rolled her eyes to the ceiling. Now, does he really believe it's only one?
No.
Because he looked across the horizon, and what did he see? A fire. So he knew it was probably more. As the boy looked for cloth to bind, now what cloth is he going to be looking for? Muslin. Very good. To bind Charlie's legs, she said, "There ain't no such thing as one Indian." Dewey paused. The glow he had seen on the horizon gave truth to her words. He pulled a piece of muslin from a drawer and began to tear it into strips. Now the urgency of looking after the dog began to replace his fear. "Maybe Pa'll be home in the morning," he said. "Your Pa won't be home for a week." Dewey began to bind Charlie's leg to stop the flow of blood, and the dog whimpered and licked the boy's hand with his warm tongue. Dewey split one end of the cloth and wound it around the leg, then tied it in a knot. "Now lie there," he said, "and don't move around or you'll make the bleeding worse." His grandma had begun to cry, not noisily, so Dewey did not notice at first. So how many of you have done that before? Maybe your feelings were hurt or you were really upset and you weren't sobbing, crying. You just held it in and tears were just streaming down because you didn't want mom or dad or a friend to see that you were really upset. Anybody? Okay. So that's what Grandma didn't want him really to see. She didn't, because usually when people are crying, they're upset, they're hurt, they're afraid. And if you see that, sometimes you feel that way as well. So I think she was not wanting Dewey to see because she didn't want Dewey to be nervous or scared because he was in charge of taking care of the barn and the farm, right? Unchecked, they fell to her blouse. So meaning she didn't wipe them away. She didn't check on them. And she made no effort to wipe them away. Her tears upset him almost more than the encounter with the Indian. In all his life, he had never seen a woman cry. He had heard his mother cry the night they knew his pa wasn't going to die with a fever. The night his pa had looked at her and for the first time in weeks had recognized her. Sometimes when you had a fever so high, boys and girls, you became delirious. You didn't know what was going on. Because remember, we're back in the 1800s. They didn't have Aleve. They didn't have Tylenol. They didn't have Advil. So you just had to work, the fever had to work its way out of you. But those had been happy tears. These seemed hopeless, and there was no sound at all. I only saw one of them, Grandma, and he's gone. He left on his pony. What is Dewey trying to do? Trying to calm her down, reassure her. She said nothing, did not even look at him, and the tears continued to slip down her cheeks. I said the Indian's gone, he said slowly. We'll probably never see him again. She took a deep breath that rattled in her throat. Oh, we'll see him again. Him and a dozen of his brothers. She still did nothing about the tears. Don't say that. He had known this himself the moment he had seen the fire on the horizon, but he did not want to hear it. Then he said, if they come back, we'll hide. That's it. We'll just hide, Grandma. Sometimes at night he thought about what he would do if raiding Indians came, and this was what he had decided. He would hide, flatten himself in the wheat and wait. Sometimes in the hot summer afternoons, he had even gone and hidden to see how long he could remain absolutely still. There ain't no place an Indian can't find you, she said dully. They got animal noses. They can smell you out. Well, it's better than just sitting here, ain't it? At least if we was hiding somewhere, we'd have a chance. We ain't got no chance, boy. We have too got a chance. No chance at all. The suggestion that there was no hope for him made him furious, and he grabbed her hand. We have too got a chance, and don't you say anything different. I'll get some things together and we'll get out of here. She did not speak. The fear of Indians had been with her since they came to the prairie. She never left the cabin without first scanning the waving grass for some sign of their presence. Whose presence? Indians had sometimes passed the cabin, lean and dusky on their shaggy, neglected ponies. They had come into the cabin and eaten corn cakes and deer before the fireplace, dropping on their haunches and never lifting their eyes from the hearth. Who was there when they came in and had food at their house? Who was there? Pa was there. They won't harm anyone, Pa had said again and again, and Dewey had looked at the Indians and believed him. There were no words, however, that could lessen Grandma's fears. In her mind were the terrible stories of the Indian massacres, meaning the Indians killed a lot of people at one time, of families wiped out, so the whole families were killed, of children stolen, of women scalped. Do you know what it means to be scalped? A knife's taken on your head and your scalp. This is your scalp that the hair grows out. They cut it off with the hair and they carry it around like an award. It was kind of a badge of honor. These tales had been passed from cabin to cabin, had grown in the retelling, and now, in this wide open prairie where there was no place to hide, they tormented her. Okay? When people retell things, sometimes the stories there's a little bit more added to it. It's called operator. You tell somebody something, if they tell somebody else, the story sometimes gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And more obnoxious. But she lets that torment her. Tonight, it seemed, all her fears were coming true. She sat in her chair, dully watching him as he yanked a blanket from the bed, laid it on the floor, and began to pile things onto it. He took what food there was on the shelf, on the table, by the fireplace, and threw it on the blanket. Without looking at his grandma, he tied the ends securely and then crossed the room and picked up the gun. Come on, Grandma, we better. And then he paused. He swallowed. Grandma! Grandma! She sensed the urgency in his voice and feared the Indians were upon them. Where? She asked, half rising from her chair. Grandma, listen to me. He grabbed her hand. We'll go down the river to the Darganses. Grandma, we'll go down the river. She looked at him, right at him, for the first time. What are you talking about, boy? I'm talking about my boat. We'll get on it and we'll float down the river. Grandma, we can do it. I know we can. Down the river? Yes'm. If we could get to the Darganses, they'd help us. We could stay there till Ma and Pa come back by. Yes, the Dargans would help us, she admitted. Then come on, Grandma. She hesitated. All right then, don't come, he said, his voice rising. Just sit there till the Indians come if you want to. Just sit there and wait for the Indians. She stood up and reached for a cane in one motion. I'll try it, she said. I didn't come 1,000 miles to have no Indian take my scalp. You get them things down to the boat and we'll get started. He took the bundle, picked up his oar from the doorway, and moved awkwardly down the path. He flung them onto the raft and hurried back to the cabin. His grandma was stepping to the door, and the time it had taken him to run to the raft and back, she had gotten ready. Her bonnet, the white one with lace that she saved for special occasions, was on her head, and in her hand was her velour satchel. Okay? The satchel is kind of like a purse, a small bag with a shoulder strap for carrying small items. I'll get the dog, he said. Charlie struggled to his feet, and Dewey grabbed him around the middle. Without pausing, he ran with him to the raft. Wait there, he said, then ran back up the path to help his grandma. Don't upset me now, she cried as he ran toward her. She shook her cane at him. I won't, Grandma. I'll just take your satchel for you. She handed it to him and said, You take care with that, boy. Every valuable I've got in the world is in that satchel. Yes'm. She looked back into the cabin, at the kettle on the fireplace, at the dough she had put on the hearth, at the clean bedding, at the cradle hallowed like a tiny dugout from a cottonwood log. Who was that cradle for?
The baby.
The baby. Quickly, while she was standing there, Dewey ran to the pig pens. He opened the first pen and shooed the pigs out into the clearing. Get! You! Get now! The pigs, startled, moved out of the pen and stood looking back at him, snorting softly. Why would he do that?
So he doesn't have, so the animals can roam around, so the Indians don't take them.
So the Indians can't get them for food. He doesn't think they're going to be coming back, so he's letting them go. If he does come back and the animals were still left in the pen, do you think they'll be there?
No.
Probably not. The pigs, startled, moved out of the pen and stood looking back at him, snorting softly. He opened the pen where the two fattened boars had risen to their feet and were looking at him. Get, you! Get! Before his pa had left, he had said, When we get back, first thing, we'll kill the hogs. And Dewey's mouth had watered at the thought of the juicy ham. Get! You want the Indians to eat you? Get! The red boars moved out of the pen. Dewey opened the door to the sod barn and let out Brownie and her calf. By habit, they turned slowly and started walking down the path to the fenced pasture by the river. Get! He said, waving Grandma's satchel at them. The cow and her calf quickened their pace, slowed as Dewey went back to the cabin, and then stopped. Come on, Grandma! Carefully, one step at a time, she left the cabin and made her way down the bank. So intent was she on finding a secure footing that she was all the way to the edge of the river before she got her first glimpse of the Rosy Bee. There she is, Dewey said proudly as he saw her look at the raft. She didn't speak for a moment. What does that tell you?
She likes it.
If you don't say something, what have you always been told? Don't say. If you can't say something nice, don't
Say.
anything at all. She didn't speak.
Maybe she doesn't like it.
She couldn't. The word boat had brought to mind a sturdy craft. She remembered the heavy steamboats of the Missouri with their upper decks loaded with wagons, the keel boats built to carry men and beasts, boats that would not tip or splinter no matter how swift the current. The sight of the log raft stunned her. "This here's the boat?" she asked finally. Sensing her dismay or displeasure, he said quickly, "Well, it'll get us there, Grandma." She closed her eyes for a moment. In the moonlight, she seemed pale, washed of strength, which tells us what? She's probably not looking forward to getting on that boat. She doesn't think they're going to make it. "Are you all right, Grandma?" She opened her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and said, "I'm all right. Let's get." She paused a moment and then said firmly, "Get aboard." "Wait a minute, Grandma." "Just wait." He ran back up the path and into the cabin, where he returned. When he returned, he was carrying her rocking chair upside down on his head. This was the chair she had brought with her on the long trip west, strapped on the side of the wagon, and now she managed a faint smile. "Grandma, you going down the river in style," he said, "like a lady on a steamboat." He set the chair in the center of the raft and, standing knee-deep in the water, helped her aboard. She clutched his shoulder so tightly he thought his flesh would be bruised by her fingers. Then she was on the raft, sitting gingerly in her chair, sitting cautiously. "I don't like it." "I'll push off," Dewey said quickly, before she could decide to go back to the cabin. He lifted the nose of rope from around the trunk stump, dropped it on the raft, and pushed slowly out from the bank. His feet were stuck in the loose, muddy bottom, and as he drew them out, he thought of the quicksand. He scrambled aboard. The weight of his body caused the raft to dip momentarily, and his grandma cried, "Don't upset me, boy," and almost struck him over the head with the cane in her alarm or her nervousness. "It's all right, Grandma. It's all right. See how steady we are now? You know how boats tip when you get on? Okay." She placed her cane across her lap and settled back in her chair. "I want to tell you one thing, boy, before we get started." "We're already started," Dewey said, watching the bank slip away. She ignored him. "Before we get started, I want to say one thing. I didn't come no 1,000 miles out to this wild land to be scalped." "Yes'm, you told me." "That's just the first part. Also, I didn't come no 1,000 miles out here to be drowned neither. Understand me, boy?" "Yes'm, I won't drown you." He swallowed. "If I can help it. When I die, it's going to be in my bed, and I'm going to be buried yonder by the plum trees with my feet pointing east so I can see the sun rising on Judgment Day. You hear me, boy?" So she's thinking that's when God's going to come and going to stand before him and say, "Were you good or were you evil?" "Yes'm." "All right, then. We can get started now," she said. "But I tell you one more thing. I don't trust this here boat, and I don't trust this here river. Ain't neither one of them anything to look at." From the first moment she had seen Trouble River, she had mistrusted it. It was nothing like the beautiful rivers in the East. Its waters were murky and discolored. From a distance, it appeared to be yellow. On closer inspection, merely muddy. It was broad, but not deep, with banks of sand or clay, and only an occasional grove of cottonwoods for shade. The creeks that emptied into it were called Dry Gulch, Dead Man's Creek, Salt Run, Rusty Springs, These streams, plus the groundwater from the sand hills, were all that kept the river flowing throughout the year. It was like a snake moving slowly with coiling, twisting movements through the prairie grass. Simile or metaphor? It was like. Simile, it's comparing the snake with the river using the word like.